In about 3100 BC, the independent city-states of the narrow Nile Valley and the Nile Delta united to form one long realm. Lines of heroic, semi-divine kings emerged to rule this new land. Lines of beautiful queens stood dutifully by their side. If, occasionally, the kings were less heroic, and the queens less beautiful than perhaps they could have been, it didn't matter overmuch. State propaganda would ensure that they were remembered as they should have been, not as they were. 3,000 years of dynastic rule were to see at least 300 kings claiming sovereignty over the two lands. Those 300 kings were married to several thousand queens, of whom Cleopatra VII was the last. Memories of these queens were embedded in Egypt, in tombs, on temple walls, in palace archives, funerary cults and statuary. But as dynasty succeeded dynasty, century succeeded century, the cults failed, the architecture was destroyed, and all understanding of the hieroglyphic script was lost. One group of queens was, however, never forgotten. The Ptolemies, the last dynasty of independent Egypt, enjoyed 3 centuries of rule. Their stories, an integral part of Roman history, were also recorded in Latin and in Greek. Best remembered of all was Cleopatra VII, certainly not the most successful Ptolemy nor the longest lived, but the Ptolemy whose decisions and deeds influenced 2 of Rome's greatest men, and in so doing affected the development of the Roman Empire. Her story did more than survive in dusty official histories. Both Cleopatra and Egypt were seen as sexy in all modern senses of the word, and the thrilling mixture of decadence, lust and unnatural death, the contrast between the seductive but decaying power of ancient Egypt and the virile, disciplined strength of Rome, captured the imaginations of generations of artists and poets, so that Cleopatra evolved into a semi-mythological figure recognized throughout the world. The birth of Cleopatra VII in the winter of 70 to 69 BC is nowhere recorded. To calculate her birth year, we have to work backwards from her death, which is known to have occurred in 30 BC, when she was 39 years old. The name of Cleopatra's mother is similarly unrecorded. Given that the king Auletes openly acknowledged Cleopatra as his daughter, do we really care today who this missing mother was? Yes, not because we care overmuch about illegitimacy, but because we care perhaps too much about race and appearance. And with Cleopatra's paternal line firmly rooted in the Macedonian Ptolemaic family tree, Cleopatra's mother and grandmothers hold the key to her ethnicity. 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra still has political relevance, and arguments over her racial heritage, was she black or white, inspire fierce debate, with black variously defined as meaning of Egyptian origin, or a person from non-Mediterranean Africa, or any person of colour, and white usually being equated with Greek. These definitions, of course, are open to charges of Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. But can we not have black Greeks, or non-black Africans? In the USA in particular, the recognition that traditional history has too often been written by a male, Eurocentric elite has led to the development of the theory, sincerely held by many, that Cleopatra was a black Egyptian queen whose achievements have been reallocated to a white Proto-European. Scholarly discussions and heated internet arguments abound between the black and white camps. So who exactly was Cleopatra VII? We know that she was a direct descendant of Ptolemy I, a Macedonian. Culturally, the Ptolemies were Hellenistic Macedonians. But what of Cleopatra's racial heritage? We suspect her mother was Cleopatra V, who might have been closely related to Cleopatra's father, Auletes. If, however, Cleopatra's mother was not a Ptolemy, then she could have been an elite woman from anywhere in the Hellenistic world, although it seems most likely she was either Egyptian or Greek. But can we assume that an Egyptian mother would be pure Egyptian? For almost 3,000 years, tradition, theology and ideology had taught the Egyptian elite that they lived at the heart of the civilized world. Those who lived and died by Egyptian custom within Egypt were Egyptian, the most blessed people in the world. Egyptianness was very much a matter of culture. Colour, both skin tone and racial heritage, was an irrelevance. Libyans, Nubians, Asiatics and others had settled beside the Nile, and individual Egyptians had freely married people who looked or spoke differently. As a result, there was a diverse range of racial characteristics, with red-headed light-skinned Egyptians living alongside darker-skinned neighbours. This makes it difficult to estimate just how many Egyptians were actually of non-Egyptian origin. All we can conclude from this survey of just 2 generations is that in the crudest of statistical terms, Cleopatra was somewhere between 25% and 100% of Macedonian extraction, and that she possibly had some Egyptian genes. So she's most likely to have had dark hair and an olive or light brown complexion. Roman historians did not believe that childhood experiences helped to shape the adult. So we know very little about Cleopatra's childhood in, we assume, Alexandria. But we do know that raised to stand alongside their brothers as queens, the Ptolemaic women participated in state affairs, and some were effective and occasionally ruthless queens. They were women of substance, owning land, property and bank accounts. The extent to which these highly professional businesswomen were formally educated is unclear. To be effective, they had to be able to read, write and do arithmetic, also to understand the laws, history and traditions of Greece, Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world. Cleopatra VII must have had private tutors, borrowed, we might reasonably assume, from the Museum, home to the world-famous scholars of Alexandria. But they, like most of her personal advisers, go unrecorded. Cicero, who met and took an instant dislike to Cleopatra, confirms that she had academic leanings. Her promises were all things to do with learning, and not derogatory to my dignity. Plutarch writes that she could readily turn to whichever language she pleased, so that there were few foreigners she had to deal with through an interpreter, and to most she herself gave her replies without an intermediary. To the Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes and Parthians, it is said that she knew the language of many other peoples also, although the preceding kings of Egypt had not tried to master even the Egyptian tongue, and some had indeed ceased to speak the Macedonian dialect. This tradition of Cleopatra the intellectual would persist, and medieval Arab historians would revere Cleopatra as the Virtuous Scholar, a philosopher, alchemist, mathematician and physician with a special interest in gynecology, although the only evidence for her interest in medicine is the fact that she supported a temple associated with female health and healing. It is perhaps more telling that she employed the distinguished scholar Nicolaus of Damascus to educate her twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Clearly, she regarded education as an important matter for both boys and girls. Cleopatra's father, Auletes, understood that Egypt's future was bound up with the future of Rome. Unfortunately, he was incapable of persuading his people, the kingmakers of Alexandria, to accept the situation. Hindsight makes it all seem terribly obvious. Egypt was a fertile and ill-defended land ripe for the taking, while Rome was a greedy, ever-expanding military nation with a constant need for grain, and a legal claim, however dubious, over Egypt. As Auletes' reign progressed, Egypt's position went from bad to worse. Only by increasing his cooperation with Rome could he hope to keep his kingdom. In 60 BC, Pompey, Crassus and Gaius Julius Caesar united to form the First Triumvirate. Essentially, the three now ruled Rome. Seizing his moment, Auletes offered 6,000 silver talents, an almost unimaginable sum equivalent to half of Egypt's entire annual revenue, in exchange for recognition as Egypt's true king. They accepted, and Auletes, having sacrificed his dignity, saved his crown, and bought Egypt a few more years of independence. Auletes had been recognized as an ally, but his brother Ptolemy had not. In 58 BC, the Romans annexed Ptolemy's kingdom, Cyprus. Ptolemy declined the offer of an honourable retirement as high priest of Aphrodite at Paphos and swallowed poison. As the Alexandrians took to the streets in the capital city to protest against their king's apparent indifference to his brother's fate, Auletes fled first to Rhodes and then to Rome. With her unpopular father absent, Berenice IV proclaimed herself queen and ruled for 2 years with the full support of the Alexandrians. Auletes' exile continued until early in 55 BC he managed to bribe Gabinius, governor of Syria, to give him military support. As Plutarch delicately puts it, Gabinius himself felt a certain dread of the war, although he was completely captivated by the 10,000 talents. Later that same year, Pelusium, Egypt's easternmost city, fell to Gabinius's mercenary army. Auletes returned home in triumph to find Alexandria suffering under a fairly brutal foreign occupation. His vengeance was swift and uncompromising. Berenice and her most prominent supporters were executed, and their confiscated property was used to repay some of Auletes' ever-increasing debts. Auletes emerged from the bloodshed, a poverty-stricken king, whose family had been torn apart by treachery, and whose country was suffering from erratic Nile floods and unacceptably high taxation. He was, in addition, a pharaoh without a queen. This was extremely rare. The precise role of the traditional Egyptian queen consort is ill understood, but it seems that she offered the king a vital female element that would complement his maleness and make him a whole, perfect ruler. Kings whose consorts died acquired a replacement consort quickly. Given the shortage of Ptolemaic brides, it's possible that Auletes used his eldest surviving daughter as his consort and partner in religious rituals. Inscriptions in the Dendera temple of Hathor link the king's name with the cartouche of a Cleopatra, and with an unnamed woman who is described as the eldest daughter of the king. It is likely that this is Cleopatra VII. There is, however, no suggestion that Auletes married Cleopatra. Father-daughter incest was not acceptable in the Hellenistic world, even at the louche court of Auletes. When in 51 BC Auletes died an apparently natural death, the throne passed to the 18-year-old Cleopatra and her eldest brother, the 10-year-old Ptolemy. Auletes' will appointed the people of Rome guardians of Egypt's new king and queen and protectors of the Ptolemaic dynasty. This was just the beginning of Cleopatra's long and highly personal involvement with Rome and the Romans.